The chatter and laughter from Jessica's dining room fell silent the moment I walked in with the final dish. My signature maple pecan pie, still warm from the oven. 18 dishes. I had prepared 18 different Thanksgiving dishes over the past 3 days, each one made with care and precision despite my arthritic hands. But as I stood there, dessert in hand, what I saw made my heart sink. A table set for 12, with every seat filled. There was no place for me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Oh, Mom, Jessica said, barely glancing up from her conversation with Emma. Just put that on the sideboard with the other desserts. We're actually full at the table. Emma brought her new boyfriend last minute. I looked at my daughter, this stranger in designer clothes who had somehow grown from the little girl I once cradled, and something inside me finally broke. Not with a bang, but with a quiet resolve that settled over me like the first winter snow. Silent, yet profound. "Where will I sit?" I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. Jessica's eyes darted around the room, never quite meeting mine. "Maybe you could eat in the kitchen, or take a plate home. You must be tired after all that cooking anyway." My grandson Noah looked up, his 8-year-old face scrunched in confusion. "But Grandma made everything. Why can't she sit with us?" In that moment, watching my own daughter shush her son rather than answer his perfectly reasonable question, I made a decision that would change everything. No one at that table could have possibly imagined what I would do next. I wasn't always invisible. Once, I was Margaret Wilson, beloved third-grade teacher at Oak Ridge Elementary for 32 years. Children would run to hug me in grocery stores. Parents would stop me to share their child's latest achievement. I had a husband who, while not perfect, seemed to value our comfortable life together. I had a daughter who I thought loved me. I had purpose. But retirement has a way of erasing you, bit by bit. First went my classroom, then my daily routine, and finally, after Daniel abruptly announced at 65 that he wanted a divorce to experience life more fully with his executive assistant, my identity as a wife, I became background noise in my own life, existing primarily to provide free childcare, holiday meals, and emotional support whenever it was convenient for Jessica. The Thanksgiving disaster didn't happen overnight. Looking back, I can trace the warning signs over months, perhaps years. Jessica's calls becoming shorter, her visits more infrequent unless she needed something. The way she interrupted me mid-sentence when I tried to share stories from my teaching days. The casual dismissal of my opinions with a patronizing, "That's not how things work anymore, Mom." 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, Jessica called with a special request. "Mom, we're hosting everyone this year," she announced. "Ryan's parents, Emma and her new boyfriend Daniel and Veronica, plus a couple of Ryan's colleagues who are important for his partnership track." I gripped the phone tighter. "Daniel and Veronica?" My ex-husband and his new wife, 20 years his junior, who had never once acknowledged my existence at family gatherings. "Yes, it'll be fine. You're over all that, right? Anyway, I need you to handle the cooking. You know how everyone raves about your Thanksgiving spread, and I just don't have time with this big campaign launch. I'll text you the menu." Her tone left no room for discussion, and like always, I agreed. The text came an hour later. An absurd list of 18 dishes, including 3 types of pie, 4 side dishes that required completely different oven temperatures, and Daniel's favorite bourbon-glazed ham alongside the traditional turkey. For 3 days straight, I cooked. My Social Security check barely covered the groceries, but I didn't complain. I ferried dishes back and forth from my small cottage to Jessica's sprawling home in Pinewood Estates, arranging everything exactly as she instructed. Jessica barely acknowledged the work, too busy posting perfectly staged photos of her Thanksgiving preparations on Instagram. When I asked about the seating arrangement, she waved dismissively. Don't worry about that, Mom. I've got it covered. And now, standing in her dining room with my maple pecan pie, the 18th dish, made with pecans I'd carefully toasted to bring out their flavor, I understood exactly what covered meant. It meant everyone but me. I placed the pie on the sideboard as instructed, smoothed down my best dress, the one I'd ironed carefully that morning, and looked around the room one more time. At Daniel, who caught my eye, then quickly looked away. At Jessica, already turning back to Emma as if I'd vanished. At my grandchildren, confused but quickly distracted by the feast before them. At the empty kitchen where a single plate awaited me. Actually, I said, my voice carrying enough that heads turned, I think I'll head home. Enjoy your dinner, everyone. Jessica frowned, her perfect hostess mask slipping for a moment. But Mom, you can't just leave. Who's going to serve the gravy? And cut the pies later? I picked up my purse from the hallway table. I'm sure you'll figure it out, Jessica. After all, these are your dishes now. The walk home was long and cold, but with each step away from my daughter's house, I felt a strange lightening. For the first time in years, I was acting rather than reacting. The realization brought tears to my eyes, not of sadness, but of clarity. I had become so accustomed to being needed only for what I could provide that I'd forgotten how to exist for myself. My cottage felt emptier than usual that night. The refrigerator held only a carton of milk and some bread. Everything else had gone into Jessica's feast. I made myself toast with jam and sat at my small kitchen table, wondering how I'd reached this point. When had I become so disposable to the people I loved most? The answer came in fragments of memory. Jessica's graduation, where Daniel took all the credit for her success. The way he'd begun criticizing my provincial teaching career once his business took off. How Jessica learned to mirror his dismissive attitude. The divorce where I'd asked for so little, just wanting it over, while Daniel's lawyer pushed to minimize even that. The way Jessica had sided with her father, telling me I was being dramatic when I cried over losing the home I'd kept for 30 years. I'd spent my life believing that love meant service, that my value lay in what I could give others. Now, at 64, I sat alone on Thanksgiving with nothing but toast and the slowly dawning understanding that I had allowed myself to become a footnote in my own story. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. The gravy is lumpy and Ryan's mother is complaining. Can you come back and fix it? Not, are you okay? Not, I'm sorry. Just another demand. I turned off my phone and did something I hadn't done in years. I took out a notebook, turned to a fresh page, and began to write. Not about my hurt or disappointment, but about what I wanted for the remaining years of my life. What Margaret Wilson, not Jessica's mother or Daniel's ex-wife or the retired teacher, truly wanted. By morning, I had a plan. It began with a visit to my bank, where I closed the joint account I still inexplicably shared with Jessica, the one from which she regularly borrowed, without discussion. The manager's eyebrows rose when I explained I wanted to redirect my teacher's pension to a new private account. You're sure about this, Mrs. Wilson? Family accounts are quite common. I'm very sure, I replied. It's time I managed my own finances. Next came the harder part. For years, I'd kept my mother's antique silver service in storage, unable to use it in my small cottage but unwilling to part with it. It was the one thing of value I'd insisted on keeping in the divorce, despite Daniel's protests. Now, I took it to Hartford's most reputable antique dealer and sold the entire set. The appraiser, an elderly man with kind eyes, counted out more cash than I'd expected. Georgian silver, he explained. Don't see craftsmanship like this anymore. I tucked the money into my purse, feeling a strange mix of loss and liberation. My mother might have understood. She'd always said her silver was meant to be used, not hidden away. In a way, I was finally putting it to use. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When I returned home, there were 6 missed calls from Jessica and 1 text that simply read, "Where are you? Noah has a school project due tomorrow on family history. Need you to help him ASAP." I didn't respond. Instead, I called Lauren Davis, my neighbor who had retired from real estate law 3 years earlier. "Lauren," I said when she answered, "remember that offer you made to help me review some documents? I'd like to take you up on that now." 2 hours later, sitting at Lauren's dining table surrounded by papers, I took the first concrete step toward reclaiming my life. Lauren's eyes widened as she reviewed the deed to my cottage, the cottage Daniel had generously let me keep in the divorce. "Margaret, do you realize what this clause means? Daniel retained right of first refusal if you ever sell, but at the market value from 5 years ago. Property in Oak Ridge has nearly doubled since then." I nodded. Daniel always did think he was the clever one. Lauren's expression hardened. "This is borderline predatory. Did your lawyer not explain this?" "I didn't have one," I admitted. "Daniel said we could save money with just his corporate attorney handling everything. I wanted it over with." Lauren shook her head, then squared her shoulders. "Well, there are ways to address this. It'll take some time, but if you're willing to fight." "I am," I said, surprising myself with my conviction. "I'm more than willing." That night, Jessica showed up at my door unannounced, Noah in tow. Her expression was a perfect blend of irritation and confusion, as if I were a household appliance that had unexpectedly malfunctioned. "Mom, I've been calling you all day. Noah needs help with his project and you weren't answering. What's going on? And why did I get a notification that you closed our account?" I looked at my grandson, his small face pinched with anxiety, clearly uncomfortable being used as a pawn in his mother's game. "Noah, honey, there are cookies in the kitchen tin. Why don't you help yourself while your mom and I talk?" Once Noah was out of earshot, I faced my daughter. "Jessica, I'm happy to help Noah with his project, but from now on, I need advance. Notice, not last-minute demands. And yes, I closed our joint account. I should have done it years ago." Jessica's mouth fell open. "But that's how I've been managing your bills. Are you having memory issues? Do we need to talk about assisted living?" The suggestion that my desire for financial independence equated to cognitive decline was so absurd that I almost laughed. My memory is fine. Better than fine, actually. I'm remembering who I was before I became everyone's convenient helper. That person made her own decisions about her money and her time. Jessica's expression shifted from confusion to something harder. "Is this about Thanksgiving? Mom, you're being ridiculous. It was just dinner. If you'd stayed, we would have figured something out." "It wasn't just dinner," I said quietly. "It was a symbol of how you see me, how you've been seeing me for years." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I'm making some changes, Jessica. I'll still be your mother and Noah and Zoe's grandmother. But I won't be your cook, your ATM, or your emergency childcare service anymore." Jessica's face flushed. "After everything Dad and I have done for you, this is how you repay us? By having some kind of senior rebellion?" The unfairness of her statement struck me like a physical blow. "What exactly has your father done for me, Jessica? Left me after 30 years of marriage? Taken most of our savings? Or are you referring to how he convinced me to cash out my portion of his retirement to help you and Ryan with the down payment on your house? Money I've never seen repaid?" Jessica's eyes narrowed. "He gave you this cottage." "No," I corrected her. "This cottage was purchased with my inheritance from Grandma Rose. Your father merely allowed me to keep what was already mine." The confusion on Jessica's face might have been comical if it weren't so heartbreaking. She genuinely didn't know. Daniel had rewritten our history so thoroughly that even our daughter believed his version. "Noah and I should go. Jessica said stiffly. Obviously, you're not in a helpful mood. Noah can stay, I offered. I'd be happy to work on his project with him. For a moment, Jessica hesitated, her need for free childcare warring with her anger. Finally, she nodded curtly. Fine. I'll pick him up in 3 hours. But Mom, we're not done talking about this account situation. After she left, I sat with Noah at my kitchen table, helping him create a family timeline for his project. His innocent questions opened doors to stories I'd never told him. About my college years studying education, about meeting Daniel when we were both young and idealistic, about my early teaching career. Grandma, he asked suddenly, why didn't you have a seat at Thanksgiving? The directness of children can be startling. I considered sugarcoating my answer, then decided against it. Noah deserved honesty. Sometimes, Noah, people forget to make space for others at their table. Not because they're bad people, but because they stop seeing them as people who deserve space. He frowned, processing this. That's not right. You made all the food. No, I agreed. It wasn't right. But I'm going to make sure I always have a seat at my own table from now on, and there will always be room for you. He seemed satisfied with this answer, and we returned to his project. But as we worked, a plan began forming in my mind, a plan that would either heal my family or reveal that there was nothing left to heal. Either way, I would no longer be the invisible woman standing in the doorway with a pie no one had asked for, waiting for permission to exist in my own life. The next morning, I made 2 calls. The first was to Thomas Wilson, Daniel's brother, who had always treated me with kindness even after the divorce. The second was to the manager of the Oak Ridge Community Center, where I'd taught a few summer programs before retirement. By the time Jessica arrived to pick up Noah's completed project, I had set something in motion that would change everything, not just for me, but for all of us. Your project looks wonderful, Noah, I said, helping him pack it carefully into Jessica's car. I know your teacher will be impressed. Jessica, still stiff from our argument, managed a grudging, thanks. As she turned to leave, I touched her arm gently. Jessica, I want you to know that I love you very much. That won't ever change, no matter what happens next. She looked momentarily puzzled, then shrugged off my hand. Drama isn't a good look at your age, Mom. As I watched them drive away, I felt a curious sense of peace. For the first time in years, I was acting from a place of clarity rather than obligation or fear. Whatever came next, I would face it as Margaret Wilson, not as anyone's mother, ex-wife, or convenient helper, but as myself. And Margaret Wilson, as it turned out, had quite a bit more strength than anyone had given her credit for. The winter chill had settled over Oak Ridge by the time I received Jessica's invitation to her New Year's Eve party. The card, embossed and professionally printed, arrived sandwiched between utility bills and holiday catalogs, an afterthought that perfectly encapsulated our relationship these days. Join us for a sophisticated evening of cocktails and conversation, it read. Black tie optional. At the bottom, Jessica had scrawled a hasty note. Mom, we need those stuffed mushrooms everyone loves. 2 batches. And can you come early to help set up? Thanks. No, we miss you, or hope you'll join us. Just another demand wrapped in the thinnest veneer of invitation. I placed the card on my kitchen counter and stared at it, remembering our last interaction at Thanksgiving. In the weeks since, Jessica had returned to her usual pattern. Brief, practical texts about the grandchildren, occasional requests for favors, but no acknowledgement of what had happened. It was as if she believed that enough time and silence would reset our relationship to its previous imbalance. Meanwhile, I had been busy. Lauren and I had spent hours poring over my financial documents, uncovering patterns I'd been too close to see. How Daniel had gradually taken control of our accounts while I focused on raising Jessica and teaching. How my paycheck had covered our daily expenses while his went to investments in his name only. How the modest inheritance from my mother had somehow been diverted into a college fund for Jessica that Daniel controlled. A fund that, as Lauren pointed out, showed numerous withdrawals that didn't align with tuition payments. "This is classic financial isolation," Lauren had said, her voice gentle but firm, "make you dependent, then convince you it's for your own good because you're not capable of managing money." I'd bristled initially, defensive despite myself. Daniel isn't abusive. He never hit me. Lauren's smile had been sad. Abuse comes in many forms, Margaret. Control is abuse. Isolation is abuse. Convincing someone they're incapable is abuse. The words had lodged in my chest like small stones, heavy with truth I wasn't ready to fully examine. Now, staring at Jessica's invitation, I saw the same pattern extending to my daughter. The assumption that I existed to provide service. The expectation that I would silently accept whatever space they deigned to give me. The casual erasure of my needs, my dignity, my very personhood. I picked up my phone and, before I could reconsider, typed, "I won't be able to make the stuffed mushrooms or help set up. I have other plans that evening, but I'll try to stop by the party briefly. Happy New Year, Jessica." Her response came within minutes. "Other plans? What other plans? Mom, everyone expects those mushrooms. It's tradition." I set the phone down without responding, a small act of rebellion that sent my heart racing. In the past, I would have canceled whatever conflicted, would have apologized profusely, would have spent hours preparing food for a party where I would be treated as an afterthought. Not this time. My other plans were still nebulous, but they would be mine. Perhaps dinner at the small French bistro downtown that I'd always wanted to try. Perhaps a quiet evening at home with a new book and a glass of wine. Whatever I chose, it would be because I wanted it, not because someone else had assigned it to me. The realization was disorienting. When had I last made a decision based solely on my own desires? Even my cottage, the one thing I'd insisted on keeping in the divorce, had been chosen partly because it was close enough to Jessica's home for easy babysitting access. The phone buzzed again. "Mom? Hello? Are you ignoring me? This is important." Important to whom? I wanted to ask. Instead, I turned the phone face down and walked to my small home office. Since closing the joint account with Jessica, I'd been meticulously organizing my finances. The antique silver had brought more than expected, enough to create a modest emergency fund. My teacher's pension wasn't lavish, but with careful budgeting, it covered my basic needs. For the first time in decades, I had a clear picture of what came in and what went out, without Daniel's adjustments or Jessica's borrowing. Financial independence, I was discovering, was the foundation of all other forms of freedom. I settled at my desk and opened my laptop, determined to use this burst of resolution productively. First, I registered for a community college course on digital marketing, something I'd been curious about since retirement but had dismissed as not for someone like me. Then I responded to an email from the Oak Ridge Community Center about volunteer opportunities, specifically requesting information about their senior outreach program. Small steps, yes, but in a direction entirely of my own choosing. The sensation was heady, almost dizzying. The phone buzzed again, this time with a call from an unfamiliar number. I answered cautiously. "Mrs. Wilson? This is Ryan Carter." My son-in-law's voice was a surprise. In our 12 years of family connection, Ryan had rarely initiated contact with me directly. Like many in Jessica's orbit, he treated me as an extension of my daughter, communicating through her rather than acknowledging me as an individual. "Hello, Ryan," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "What can I do for you?" "It's about New Year's. he began, an edge of impatience already creeping into his voice. Jessica mentioned you're not making the appetizers this year. Look, I know you two had some kind of disagreement at Thanksgiving, but this party is important for my career. The senior partners will be there with their wives, and Jessica is stressed enough without having to find a caterer last minute. So that was it. Not a personal call after all, but a delegation. Jessica had assigned Ryan to bring me back in line. The realization should have hurt, but instead it clarified something. I was not, and perhaps never had been, seen as a person with my own legitimate feelings and boundaries. I was a resource, valued only for what I could provide. I understand the party is important, I said carefully, but I won't be available to prepare food or help with setup. I've made other arrangements for that evening. What arrangements? Ryan demanded, echoing his wife's incredulity. Since when do you have New Year's plans that don't involve family? Since now, I thought but didn't say. Instead, I maintained my calm tone. I'm happy to share the recipe for the mushrooms if Jessica wants to make them herself. They're really quite simple. Ryan's scoff was audible. Jessica doesn't cook, you know that. She doesn't have time with her career and the kids and everything. Neither did I when I was working full-time and raising her. I wanted to point out. Instead, I simply said, I'm sure whatever she arranges will be lovely. Is there anything else? The silence stretched, filled with his disbelief that I wasn't immediately capitulating. Finally, Ryan sighed dramatically. Fine. But the kids will be disappointed. They were counting on seeing you. The emotional leverage was so transparent it was almost comical. My grandchildren, who I adored, were indeed the most effective pressure point Jessica and Ryan had. But in this case, I knew for a fact that Zoe and Noah spent every New Year's Eve with Ryan's parents, who lived in the next town over. Please give them my love, I said, not bothering to call out the manipulation. I'll see them soon. After ending the call, I sat in a strange calm, waiting for the guilt to arrive. It had been my constant companion for so long. Guilt for not being the wife Daniel wanted. Guilt for working when Jessica was young. Guilt for every boundary attempted, every need expressed, every moment of self-care that might have inconvenienced others. The emotional tax I'd paid simply for existing. But the guilt didn't come. In its place was something quieter, steadier. A certainty that I was finally stepping into a truth I'd avoided for too long. I had spent decades trying to earn love through service, only to be repeatedly shown that no amount of service would ever be enough. My phone lit up with texts from Jessica. Dad says you're being ridiculous. Ryan's boss specifically asked if you'd be making those mushrooms again. Is this still about Thanksgiving? You're really going to hold a grudge over one dinner? Each message revealed more about how my daughter viewed me, as an extension of her father's opinions, as a vehicle for impressing her husband's colleagues, as someone whose hurt feelings were inherently petty and invalid. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I opened my neglected email account and found a message I'd overlooked, sent days earlier from Thomas Wilson, Daniel's brother, and surprisingly, the one family member who had maintained contact after the divorce. Margaret, it read, I've been thinking about you since running into Jessica last week. She mentioned some tension between you two. I'm not taking sides, but I wanted to check if you're doing all right. Daniel has been saying some things that don't square with my memory of your marriage. If you'd like to talk, I'm around. No pressure either way. Thomas. The message was a small lifeline, unexpected, but welcome. Thomas had always been the quieter Wilson brother, more thoughtful and less concerned with appearances than Daniel. During family gatherings, he'd often sought me out for genuine conversation while Daniel worked the room, networking even at his own children's birthday parties. I hesitated only briefly before replying. Thomas, thank you for reaching out. Would like to talk. Are you free for coffee sometime this week? His response came within the hour. How about tomorrow at Riverside Cafe? 10 a.m.? I confirmed the plan, then turned my attention to dinner. As I prepared a simple meal, just for myself, portioned for my own appetite rather than Daniel's preferences or Jessica's schedule, I reflected on how long it had been since I'd cooked purely for my own enjoyment. Food had become so entangled, with service in my mind, that I'd forgotten it could be a pleasure rather than just another obligation. That night, I slept more soundly than I had in months. Riverside Cafe sat on the banks of the small river that wound through Oak Ridge, its large windows offering views of bare winter trees and the occasional cardinal flashing crimson against the gray landscape. I arrived early, selecting a quiet, corner table where Thomas and I could speak privately. He appeared promptly at 10, his lanky frame bundled against the December chill. Unlike Daniel, who had embraced the distinguished silver fox aesthetic as he aged, Thomas had allowed his hair to thin and gray naturally, his face to develop the comfortable lines of a man who laughed often and worried little about appearances. "Margaret," he greeted me warmly, leaning down for a brief hug before settling across from me. "You look well." "Thank you," I said, surprised to find I meant it. The woman reflected in my bathroom mirror that morning had seemed different somehow. Perhaps a bit straighter in the shoulders, a bit more present in the eyes. "It's good to see you." After we'd ordered coffee and croissants for both of us, Thomas leaned forward slightly. "So, what's going on with you and Jessica?" She was pretty. Upset when I saw her, but also evasive about the details. I considered how to respond. Thomas had always been kind to me, but he was still Daniel's brother. Family loyalty ran deep. "We had a situation at Thanksgiving," I said carefully. "Jessica asked me to cook the entire meal. Then I arrived, to find there wasn't a place for me at the table." Thomas's eyebrows shot up. "She didn't save you a seat at Thanksgiving after you cooked?" "No," I confirmed. "I was supposed to eat in the kitchen or take a plate home." He shook his head, slowly. I don't even know what to say to that. Did Daniel know about this?" "He was there," I said simply. "Emma, Jessica's friend, brought an unexpected guest, so the table was full. No one seemed particularly concerned that I didn't have a place." Thomas was quiet for a moment, stirring his coffee absently. "And this isn't the first time something like this has happened, is it?" The question held no judgment, just a gentle prompting toward honesty. I took a deep breath. "No," I admitted. "It's been a pattern for years. I'm included when they need something, childcare, cooking, emotional support, but otherwise kept at a careful distance. I've always accepted it as, I don't know, the natural order of things. But lately I've been questioning that acceptance." Thomas nodded slowly. "Daniel has been saying you're having some kind of breakdown, that you've become erratic, unpredictable. But this doesn't sound erratic to me, Margaret. It sounds like someone finally standing up for themselves." "That's what Daniel calls a breakdown," I said, a touch of bitterness creeping into my voice. Any deviation from the compliant, useful Margaret he constructed. Thomas winced slightly. "You know, after your divorce, Daniel told everyone you'd been impossible to live with for years, that you'd made his home life miserable, that you resented his success. I never quite believed it. It didn't match the Margaret I knew, but I didn't challenge him either. I should have." "It wouldn't have made a difference," I said. "Daniel has always been persuasive." "Yes," Thomas agreed. "Our father used to say Daniel could sell sand in the Sahara. He's always had a gift for making his version of events seem like the only reasonable interpretation." The waitress arrived with our order, and we paused our conversation while she set down the plates. When she left, Thomas continued, his voice lower. "The thing is, Margaret, I've been noticing some inconsistencies in Daniel's stories lately. Not just about you, but about business dealings, about his relationship with Jessica and the grandkids. Small things that don't add up. I sipped my coffee, waiting for him to elaborate. Last week, Thomas said, he mentioned that he's been supporting you financially since the divorce because you're not capable of managing money. But I distinctly remember you handling all the household finances when you were married. You were the organized one. I nodded slowly. I paid all the bills, managed the household budget. But Daniel controlled the investment accounts, the retirement funds. He made all the major financial decisions. By the time we divorced, I had no idea what we actually owned, or owed. That's what I thought, Thomas said. And yet he's convinced Jessica that you've always been financially irresponsible, that without his oversight, you'd have squandered everything. The revelation stung, but didn't surprise me. I'd sensed Jessica's judgment whenever financial matters arose, her assumption that I needed guidance like a child. It's not just money, Thomas continued. He's been rewriting your whole marriage. According to Daniel, he was the one who encouraged your teaching career, who supported your friendships, who wanted you to pursue interests outside the home. But I remember how it actually was, Margaret. I remember him complaining when you took that summer course in literature. I remember him forgetting to tell you about faculty events until the last minute. Each example hit like a small hammer, breaking. Loose memories I'd tucked away. The literature course, how Daniel had sighed dramatically each time I studied, making small comments about the house being neglected. The faculty events, arriving unprepared, without the context other spouses seemed to have, made to feel like an awkward intruder rather than a welcome partner. Why are you telling me this now? I asked, not accusingly, but genuinely curious. Thomas set down his coffee cup, meeting my eyes directly. Because I'm worried about what's happening with Jessica. She's absorbing Daniel's narrative wholesale, and it's affecting how she treats you. And frankly, I'm concerned about his influence on Noah and Zoe too. The mention of my grandchildren shifted something in my chest. I thought of Noah's innocent question at Thanksgiving. But Grandma made everything. Why can't she sit with us? And how quickly he'd been silenced. What do you think I should do? I asked. Thomas leaned back slightly. I can't tell you that. But I do think the truth matters, even when it's complicated. And I think you deserve to have your own story heard, not just Daniel's version of it. We finished our coffee in thoughtful silence, the weight of past and present choices settling between us. As we prepared to leave, Thomas said one more thing that would echo in my mind for days afterward. Daniel has always been terrified of being ordinary, Margaret. Everything he's done, the career choices, the status symbols, even the divorce, has been about proving his exceptionalism. But you never needed to be exceptional. You were content to be good, a good teacher, a good mother, a good wife. He could never understand the power in that. I mulled over Thomas's words as I drove home, seeing my marriage through this new lens. Daniel's constant striving, his dismissal of my small accomplishments, his need to position himself as the rescuer of my supposedly chaotic life, all of it stemmed from his deep fear of mediocrity. And I, with my classroom of third graders, and my modest ambitions, had been a living reminder of what he desperately sought to escape. The beauty and dignity of an ordinary life well lived. The revelation didn't excuse his behavior, but it illuminated it in a way that loosened its power over me. I had not failed as a wife by being ordinary. I had simply valued different things than Daniel. Connection over achievement, stability over status, depth over acquisition. When I arrived home, I found a package on my porch, a small box wrapped in brown paper with no return address. Inside was a silver-framed photograph of me in my classroom, surrounded by students, my face alight with joy as I helped a small boy with his project. A note accompanied it. Found this while organizing some old things. Thought you might want it. T. The photo must have been taken at least 20 years ago, back when Jessica was in high school and I was at the height of my teaching career. The woman in the frame radiated confidence and purpose, fully present in her element. I barely recognized her, this earlier version of myself who knew her worth without question. I placed the photo on my mantle, a small act of reclamation. Then I did something I'd been avoiding for weeks. I called my oldest friend, Eleanor, who had been gently reaching out since the divorce with invitations I'd consistently declined, too embarrassed by my failure as a wife to face even those who loved me best. "Margaret," her voice was warm with surprise when she answered. "What a wonderful way to start my day." "I'm sorry I've been so out of touch," I began. "Nonsense," Eleanor interrupted. "You've been going through a difficult time. No apologies needed. I'm just glad to hear your voice." The easy acceptance nearly undid me. I'd forgotten how it felt to be met with grace rather than judgment, with patience rather than demands. "I was wondering," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, "if you'd like to have dinner sometime. There's a new French place downtown. I've been wanting to try." "Are you asking me on a date, Margaret Wilson?" Eleanor teased, her laugh as infectious as I remembered. "Because I'd be delighted. How about New Year's Eve? Richard is visiting his daughter in Phoenix, so I'm completely free." New Year's Eve, the evening of Jessica's important party, the gathering I was supposedly ruining by not providing hors d'oeuvres. "That would be perfect," I said, and meant it. The days leading up to New Year's Eve brought more texts from Jessica, each more transparently manipulative than the last. The final one arrived the morning of December 31st. "Fine. I ordered catering, $300 that we didn't budget for. Hope you're happy with yourself." I stared at the message, recognizing the familiar pattern: create an obligation, assign blame, induce guilt. It had worked on me countless times before, sending me scrambling to fix whatever problem Jessica had defined as my responsibility. But this time, something different happened. I set the phone down without responding and went to prepare for my evening with Eleanor. The blue dress had been hanging in my closet for over a year, tags still attached. I'd bought it on impulse, during a rare shopping trip with Eleanor, attracted to its deep sapphire color and simple, elegant cut. But I'd never worn it, convinced by an internal voice that sounded suspiciously like Daniel, that it was too young, too noticeable, too much for someone like me. Tonight, I decided, was its debut. I paired it with silver earrings I'd had, for years but rarely worn, applied makeup with a careful hand, and stepped back to assess the result in my bedroom mirror. The woman who gazed back at me was not young, not flawless, not extraordinary. But she looked alive in a way I hadn't in years, present in her own skin, unapologetic in her existence. I barely recognized her, and yet she felt more authentically me than the faded, careful version I'd become. Eleanor's reaction when I arrived at the restaurant confirmed my impression. "Margaret Wilson," she said, rising from her table to embrace me. "You are absolutely radiant." The French bistro was everything I'd hoped. Intimate, elegant without being pretentious, filled with the murmur of conversation and the scent of exquisite food. Eleanor and I fell into our old rhythm immediately, catching up on her work as a library director, my tentative steps toward a new chapter, the books we'd read and places we hoped to visit. "You seem different," Eleanor observed over dessert, a delicate chocolate mousse we'd decided to share. More present somehow. I considered this. "I think I am. I'm starting to remember who I was before I became everyone's afterthought." Eleanor nodded, no surprise in her expression. "I've been waiting for this Margaret to reemerge. I knew she was in there somewhere." As midnight approached, the restaurant, staff distributed champagne flutes for a toast. Eleanor raised hers to me. "To new beginnings and old friends. And to you, Margaret, stepping back into your own story." We clinked glasses just as my phone buzzed in my purse. I ignored it, focusing instead on the moment at hand, the sparkle of champagne, the warm glow of the restaurant, the face of a friend who saw me clearly and valued what she saw. It wasn't until much later, after Eleanor and I had parted with plans to meet again soon, that I checked my phone. 3 missed calls from Jessica, followed by a text. "Where are you? Noah and Zoe keep asking for you. At least come by for midnight." The lie was so transparent it was almost sad. Noah and Zoe were at their other grandparents' house, as they were every New Year's Eve. Jessica knew I knew this, yet she'd deployed them as emotional leverage anyway, assuming I would either not notice or not call out the manipulation. For a brief moment, I considered responding, pointing out the lie, expressing my hurt at being so cynically manipulated. But what would that accomplish? Jessica wasn't ready to see the patterns she'd absorbed from her father, wasn't prepared to acknowledge me as someone with legitimate feelings and boundaries, rather than just a resource to be deployed. Instead, I texted a simple response. "Happy New Year, Jessica. I hope your party is everything you hoped for." Then I silenced my phone, poured myself a small nightcap, and sat in my quiet living room, the blue dress pooling around me like water. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, I felt fully present in my own life, making choices based on my own desires rather than others' expectations or demands. The feeling was both exhilarating and terrifying. I had spent so long being defined by my relationships to others, Daniel's wife, Jessica's mother, Noah and Zoe's grandmother, the helpful neighbor, the accommodating friend, that standing firmly as simply Margaret felt like stepping onto untested ice. Would it hold my weight? Would I fall through into the cold depths below? Yet as I sat there, watching the hands of the clock move past midnight and into a new year, I realized something important. I was already falling. Had been falling for years, actually, through the gradual erosion of my sense of self, the progressive diminishment of my right to exist fully in my own life. The terrifying part wasn't the falling. It was the decision to finally open my eyes during the descent, to acknowledge what was happening rather than pretending I was still on solid ground. And once my eyes were open, I could see not just the fall, but the possibility of flight. The next morning, the first morning of a new year, I woke early, my mind clear and purposeful. Eleanor's words echoed in my thoughts. Stepping back into your own story. Yes, that was exactly what I was doing. Not creating a new narrative, but reclaiming an original one that had been gradually overwritten by others. I dressed in comfortable clothes and made myself a proper breakfast, taking time to savor each bite rather than rushing through the meal as I usually did. Then I sat at my desk with a fresh notebook, uncapped a pen, and began to write. I wrote about my childhood in a small Connecticut town, the daughter of a librarian and a high school science teacher who had valued education and integrity above all else. I wrote about my college years, studying elementary education with a passion that surprised even me, discovering my gift for connecting with young minds just beginning to explore the world. I wrote about meeting Daniel at a faculty mixer, he a promising young business professor, me a first-year teacher, and our whirlwind courtship. How he had seemed genuinely interested in my work then, asking questions about my teaching methods, praising my dedication to my students. How that interest had gradually shifted to tolerance, then to thinly veiled disdain as his career ascended, and mine remained steadily in the same beloved classroom. I wrote about Jessica's birth and early years, how completely I had fallen in, love with motherhood despite its challenges. How I had continued teaching, arranging my schedule to maximize my time with her, exhausting myself trying to be fully present in both roles. I wrote about the subtle shift in our family dynamic as Daniel's career took off, the increasing pressure to present a perfect image to his colleagues, the constant comparisons to other faculty wives with their charity boards and designer wardrobes. How I had tried to adapt, to become what he seemed to want, only to discover that the goalposts kept moving beyond my reach. And I wrote about the divorce. How blindsided I'd felt when Daniel announced, just after his 65th birthday, that he needed more than our life together could provide. How he'd already consulted his lawyer, already divided our assets in his mind, already crafted a narrative of our marriage that cast him as the long-suffering husband finally breaking free. Most painfully, I wrote about Jessica's reaction, her immediate alignment with her father, her apparent relief that he would finally be happy, her casual assumption that I would continue in my supporting role while accepting my diminished status without complaint. By the time I set down my pen, the winter sun was high in the sky and my hand was cramped. I flexed my fingers, staring at the pages I had filled. They weren't meant for anyone else to read. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. But the act of recording my own experience, of asserting through ink and paper that my perspective mattered, felt like a vital step. My phone, which I had left on silent overnight, showed 5 more missed calls from Jessica, and several texts ranging from worried to angry. The final one, sent around 3 a.m., read, "Fine, ignore me. But at least let me know you're not dead in a ditch somewhere?" I composed a brief reply. "I'm perfectly fine. Had a lovely dinner with Eleanor last night and turned in early. How was your party?" Her response came quickly. "Mom, what's going on with you lately? First Thanksgiving, then New Year's. Now you're ignoring my calls. Are you angry with me about something? Just tell me so we can fix it and get back to normal." Get back to normal. The phrase illuminated everything Jessica wasn't understanding. That normal had been the problem all along. That normal meant me accepting scraps of consideration while giving everything, meant Jessica absorbing her father's dismissive attitude toward me, meant boundaries crossed without acknowledgement or apology. Instead of trying to explain all this via text, I simply wrote, "I'm not angry, Jessica. I'm changing. We should talk in person soon." Her reply was immediate. "Changing how? What does that mean? Can you come over this afternoon? The kids miss you." The emotional leverage again, using my love for Noah and Zoe to secure my prompt compliance. But this time, instead of rearranging my plans, I responded with a gentle boundary. "I have plans today, but I'd be happy to have Noah and Zoe over tomorrow after school if that works for you." A longer pause this time before her reply. "What plans? Since when do you have plans?" The question was so nakedly revealing that I almost laughed. Since when did I, Margaret Wilson, have a life that didn't revolve around my family's needs? The audacity of it. "I'll call you tonight to arrange tomorrow's visit," I texted back, not taking the bait. Then I put on my coat and headed out to meet Lauren for our scheduled review of the mysterious clause in my cottage deed, the first concrete step in securing my new independence. As I drove through Oak Ridge's tidy streets, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the quiet excitement of becoming, of stepping fully into a life that was truly, finally my own. Spring arrived in Oak Ridge with a particular sweetness that year. Cherry blossoms lined the main street, and daffodils pushed through the soil in my small garden. 3 months had passed since Thanksgiving, and in that time, I had moved through the world differently, less apologetic, more deliberate. The community center had become my second home, where I now taught 2 weekly classes, one on practical financial literacy for women over 50, and another on traditional cooking techniques. Both had started small but grown steadily as word spread. The transformation wasn't just in how I spent my time, but in how I carried myself. I'd stopped dyeing my hair, letting the silver shine through. I wore colors that pleased me rather than the muted tones Daniel had always preferred. Small changes, perhaps, but they reflected something deeper, a reclamation of self that felt revolutionary after decades of gradual erasure. Jessica and I had settled into an uneasy detente. After the shock of my financial independence wore off, she'd switched tactics, alternating between cool distance and occasional olive branches when she needed something. I maintained warm relationships with Noah and Zoe, having them over regularly but on my terms, planned visits where we baked together, worked on school projects, or simply talked. I treasured these moments, especially as I saw glimpses of understanding in their young eyes that their mother seemed to lack. What Jessica didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that my quiet revolution was about to become much less quiet. It began with a letter from Lauren's legal colleague, informing me that the clause in my cottage deed could be challenged. Unconscionable terms, the letter stated, potentially entered into under duress or without proper representation. My hands trembled as I read it. For years, I'd accepted Daniel's version of our divorce, that he'd been generous, that I was lucky to have what I did. Now, legal language confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. I had been systematically disadvantaged by the man who had promised to cherish me. The same afternoon, another letter arrived, this one from Oak Ridge Community Foundation. 6 weeks earlier, I'd submitted a proposal for a program called Second Chapter, aimed at helping divorced or widowed women over 50 rebuild their financial and social independence. The foundation had not only approved my program, but offered a modest grant to support it. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same skills I'd developed surviving my own displacement would now help others navigate theirs. I was sitting on my porch swing, letters in hand, when Thomas Wilson's car pulled into my driveway. Thomas had always been the quieter Wilson brother, less flashy than Daniel, but with a steady integrity that I'd always appreciated. Since our conversation months ago, he'd become an unexpected ally, occasionally stopping by with homemade bread, his retirement hobby, or to share news of mutual acquaintances. "Beautiful day," he called as he approached, a folder tucked under his arm. "Those daffodils are really something." I invited him to join me on the porch, pouring us both lemonade from the pitcher I'd prepared earlier. There was something comforting about these small rituals of hospitality, reclaimed now as expressions of generosity rather than obligation. "I have something for you," Thomas said after we'd exchanged pleasantries. He handed me the folder. "I've been organizing my mother's papers, and I found these. Thought you should have them." Inside were photographs, dozens of them, spanning my 30-year marriage to Daniel. There I was as a young bride, then as a new teacher, then holding baby Jessica. Family holidays, vacations, ordinary moments caught in amber. In many of them, I looked happy, vibrant even, contradicting the narrative Daniel had constructed of me as always dour, always difficult. "I don't understand," I said, throat tight. "Where did these come from?" Thomas sighed. "Mom kept copies of every family photo. She was always worried Daniel would lose them. You know how careless he could be with sentimental things." He paused. "After your divorce, when Daniel claimed there were hardly any decent photos of your marriage, I thought it was strange. I remembered all those family albums you kept." The family albums that had mysteriously disappeared during the divorce, along with so many other mementos of our shared life. "Daniel told everyone I was never happy," I said quietly. "That I'd made our home miserable. That Jessica was better, off with limited contact with me." Thomas's expression hardened. "I never believed that. None of us who really knew you did. But Daniel has always been." He searched for the right word. "Persuasive." Yes, persuasive. Persuasive enough to convince a young teacher to cover the majority of household expenses so he could invest in his business ventures. Persuasive enough to isolate me from friends who might question his narrative. Persuasive enough to turn my own daughter against me through years of subtle undermining. "There's something else you should know," Thomas said, his voice gentler now. "Daniel's been having financial troubles. Those investments he was so proud of. Many of them have collapsed. That's why he's been pressuring you to sell this place. He needs the money, and he knows he can get it at a bargain through that clause in your deed." The pieces clicked into place. Jessica's increased demands for financial help, Daniel's sudden interest in my well-being in a smaller place, the casual comments about how much developers would pay for property in this area. "Thank you for telling me," I said. carefully returning the photos to the folder. And for these, they mean more than you know. After Thomas left, I spread the photos across my kitchen table, reconstructing a life I'd been told didn't exist. There I was, laughing at Jessica's 5th birthday party. There was our family trip to the Grand Canyon, my arm around Daniel's waist. Christmas mornings, summer picnics, ordinary Tuesday evenings, all evidence of a life fully lived, not the gray existence Daniel had retroactively assigned to me. I selected a dozen photos and carefully placed them in an envelope. Then I made a phone call that would change everything. Oak Ridge Gazette? This is Margaret Wilson. I'd like to speak with Sarah Chen about the Community Spotlight series. 2. Weeks later, I stood in the community center's largest room, nervously straightening a display board. The second chapter program launch had garnered more interest than I'd anticipated, with 35 women registered and a waiting list for the next session. Sarah Chen from the Gazette had written a beautiful feature about the program, including my own journey from dependent housewife to advocate. The photos Thomas had provided offered visual evidence of the narrative I'd shared. A woman who had built a life of value, not the burden Daniel had described to anyone who would listen. Lisa Torres, the center's director, patted my shoulder. They're starting to arrive. You ready? I nodded, though my heart hammered in my chest. This public declaration of my worth, of all these women's worth, felt both terrifying and essential. As participants filed in, I recognized several. A librarian who'd divorced after 40 years, a nurse whose husband had left her for his assistant, a dentist recently widowed. Women like me, reclaiming their stories. Welcome to second chapter, I began, my teacher's voice steadier than I felt. Today marks the beginning of a new narrative, one where we recognize that our value doesn't diminish with age or circumstance, one where we understand that what happened to us is only part of our story, not its conclusion. As I spoke, the door at the back of the room opened. Jessica slipped in, taking a seat in the last row. Our eyes met briefly, hers wide with something I couldn't quite identify. I hadn't expected her, hadn't invited her, knowing she would likely dismiss this effort as another manifestation of my senior rebellion. I continued without acknowledging her presence. Many of us have been told that our worth is tied to our usefulness to others, that once our children are grown or our marriages end, we become less essential to the world. Today, we begin to dismantle that lie. The workshop progressed through exercises on financial independence, social reconnection, and identity beyond traditional roles. Throughout, Jessica remained silent in the back, her expression unreadable. The other women shared openly stories of erasure, of financial abuse disguised as protection, of adult children who had absorbed spouses' dismissive attitudes. Before we close, I said as the session neared its end, I want to share something personal. For years, I believed I was alone in my experience. I thought I was the only one whose life had been rewritten by someone else's narrative. The shame of that kept me isolated, reinforcing the story that I was the problem. I gestured to the display board, where enlarged versions of Thomas's photos stood alongside quotes from women in similar situations. But look around this room. We are not alone. We are not deficient. And most importantly, we are not finished contributing to this world. The applause that followed felt like absolution. As women gathered their materials, many stopped to thank me, to squeeze my hand, to share a few words of their own experience. Through it all, Jessica remained seated, watching. When the room had emptied except for us, she finally approached. Up close, I could see signs of strain in her face, new lines around her eyes, a tightness to her mouth that reminded me painfully of Daniel. "So this is what you've been doing," she said, gesturing to the materials scattered across tables. "Starting some kind of divorced ladies' club." I began gathering my notes, keeping my voice neutral. "It's a support program for women rebuilding their lives. The community foundation is funding it. I read the article, she said abruptly. In the Gazette. Dad's furious. Of course he was. The carefully constructed narrative of our marriage, with him as the long-suffering husband and me as the joyless burden, had been publicly challenged. Not with accusations, but with photographic evidence and my own measured words. Are those pictures even real? Jessica asked, her voice suddenly smaller. I don't remember you being so happy. The question cut deeper than any accusation could have. My own daughter couldn't reconcile the evidence of my joy with the version of me she'd been taught to see. They're real, I said quietly. Your Uncle Thomas found them in your grandmother's things. Jessica picked up one of the photos. A summer. Day at the lake. Jessica about 7 years old, both of us laughing as we built a sandcastle. I remember this day. Dad got stung by a jellyfish and was complaining the whole afternoon. Yes, I said, surprised she recalled it. He wanted to leave early, but you were having so much fun. And you let me stay, Jessica said slowly, as if accessing a memory long buried. You told Dad to go sit in the car with the air conditioning. If he was so miserable, but you weren't going to cut my day short. I nodded, my throat tight. It was a small moment, insignificant in the grand scheme, but it represented something crucial. A time when I had prioritized her joy over Daniel's comfort, contradicting the narrative that I had always been the difficult one. Jessica set the photo down carefully. Why are you doing all this, Mom? The financial independence, this program, the newspaper article. What's the point? It was the most direct question she'd asked me in years, without the usual layer of judgment or impatience. I considered my answer carefully. The point is reclaiming my story, I said finally. For too long, I let other people, your father, sometimes even you, define who I was. I believed that story because it was easier than fighting it, but it was never true. And what is true? Jessica asked, a challenge in her voice. The truth is that I was a good wife to your father for 30 years. I was a dedicated teacher who changed hundreds of children's lives. I am a mother who loves her daughter and grandchildren fiercely. And I am a woman who deserves to be seen for who she actually is, not who others need me to be to justify their own choices. Jessica's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, then back at me. Dad wants me to come over. He says we need to discuss damage control for the family reputation. The old Margaret would have apologized, would have tried to smooth things over, would have accepted responsibility for Daniel's discomfort. But I was no longer that woman. You should go if you want to, I said simply. But Jessica, before you do, ask yourself this. Whose version of our family history feels true to you? Not to your father, not to me. To you. She didn't answer, just gathered her purse and turned to leave. At the door, she paused. Noah's science fair is next Tuesday. He asked if you'd come. I'd love to, I said, recognizing the small olive branch for what it was. After she left, I sat alone in the community center room, surrounded by the evidence of my new purpose. The workshop had been a success, yes, but more importantly, it had been a declaration. I would no longer accept invisibility as my fate. That evening, as I prepared a simple dinner for myself, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Daniel's name, the first direct contact he'd initiated since Thanksgiving. Margaret, he began without preamble, his voice tight with controlled anger. What exactly do you think you're doing? Hello, Daniel, I replied, continuing to chop vegetables for my salad. I assume you're calling about the Gazette article. You had no right, he snapped, dragging our private life into the public eye, sharing personal photos without my consent. Do you have any idea how this makes me look? I set down my knife. I shared my own story, Daniel, my perspective on our marriage and divorce, And those photos belong to me as much as you. You're deliberately trying to sabotage me, he continued as if I hadn't spoken. Right when I'm trying to secure new investors. People in this town talk, Margaret. My clients are asking questions. Ah, there it was. Not concern for my well-being or interest in reconciliation, but worry about his business reputation. Even now, I was relevant only in how I might impact his bottom line. That wasn't my intention, I said truthfully. But I won't apologize for speaking about my own life. Your life? He gave a harsh laugh. What life, Margaret? Teaching finger painting to third graders? Hosting book club for other bored housewives? I gave you everything you have. The casual cruelty was so familiar, so expected, that it nearly slid past my defenses. Nearly, but not quite. Because now I had evidence, not just in Thomas's photos, but in the women who had nodded in recognition at my workshop, in Lauren's legal assessment, in my own growing confidence, that Daniel's version of our history was self-serving fiction. No, Daniel, I said, my voice steady. I earned everything. I have, including this cottage, which, by the way, I won't be selling. Not to you, not to developers, not to anyone. A long silence followed. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted to the reasonable, slightly patronizing one he used when trying to maneuver me. You're being impractical. At your age, maintaining a property is burdensome. And with the market so favorable. My lawyer disagrees, I interrupted. She thinks the clause in our deed might not hold up in court. Something about unconscionable terms and lack of proper representation. Another silence, longer this time. I could almost hear him recalculating. You've retained a lawyer? He finally asked. Yes, I confirmed, though Lauren was technically just advising me for now. It seems I should have done that during our divorce. This is ridiculous, Daniel muttered. You're turning into a vindictive old woman, you know that? This isn't what I wanted for us. What did you want for us, Daniel? I asked, genuinely curious. After 30 years, what exactly did you envision for me when you left? He sighed, as if my question was unreasonable. I wanted you to be fine, Margaret, to live quietly and not make waves, to accept the reality that people move on. To disappear, I translated. To fade into the background so you could rewrite our history without contradiction. That's not, he began, then stopped, because it was exactly what he'd wanted, and we both knew it. Daniel, I said, softer now, I don't want to hurt you. I don't want revenge. I just want to exist on my own terms for whatever years I have left. By humiliating me in the local paper? By starting some crusade for discarded wives? By telling the truth, I corrected. My truth, which deserves to be heard just as much as yours. He made a dismissive sound. Truth is subjective, Margaret. You know that. No, I said firmly. Facts might be interpreted differently, but truth exists. The truth is, you left our marriage when it no longer served your needs. The truth is, you systematically worked to isolate me from Jessica. The truth is, you're calling now not because you care about my well-being, but because my visibility threatens your carefully constructed narrative. I could hear his breathing on the other end of the line, quicker than normal. The Daniel I knew hated being confronted directly. He preferred to operate through implication and manipulation, leaving others feeling vaguely guilty without him ever having to make a specific accusation. Jessica thinks you're having some kind of breakdown, he said finally. Given your age, it's not unexpected. Cognitive decline often manifests as personality changes first. The casual cruelty of the insinuation was breathtaking. Still, I recognized the tactic. When direct confrontation failed, Daniel always resorted to questioning others' competence or sanity. I've never been clearer or more cognitively sound, I responded calmly. My doctor agrees if you'd like to speak with her. Daniel's voice hardened. This vendetta of yours needs to stop, Margaret. For Jessica's sake, if nothing else. Do you have any idea how confusing this is for her? I imagine it is confusing, I agreed. Discovering that the family narrative you've accepted might not be entirely accurate would be disorienting for anyone. She barely slept after seeing those photos, Daniel continued, a note of genuine concern in his voice now. She kept asking me if I'd lied to her about our marriage, about you. For the first time in our conversation, I felt a surge of hope. If Jessica was questioning, if she was looking at evidence rather than simply accepting her father's version, perhaps there was a chance for reconciliation deeper than our current detente. And what did you tell her? I asked. The truth, Daniel said firmly, that memories are subjective, that people remember what they want to remember, that a few happy moments captured on film don't negate years of difficult reality. Did you also tell her about the financial trouble you're in? I asked quietly. About how you need to trigger that clause in my deed to access capital for your failing investments? The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. Thomas's information had been accurate. Who told you that? Daniel finally demanded, anger replacing his reasonable tone. Thomas? My brother needs to mind his own business. Your financial problems became my business the moment you tried to leverage them to take my home, I pointed out. That cottage was always meant to be temporary, Daniel snapped. A transitional space until you figured out your next step. I laughed without humor. It's been 4 years, Daniel. How long is transitional supposed to last? This conversation is pointless, he said abruptly. Clearly you've made up your mind to be difficult. But consider this a warning. If you continue this public campaign, I'll have no choice but to defend myself. And I have friends in this town, Margaret, influential friends. Ask yourself if this crusade is really worth the potential fallout. The threat was barely veiled, but instead of fear, I felt a curious sense of clarity. The man I had once loved, had built a life with, had borne a child with, was threatening to destroy my reputation because I had dared to share my own experience of our marriage. I understand, I said quietly. Goodbye, Daniel. After hanging up, I sat at my kitchen table, the half-prepared dinner forgotten. Daniel's reaction had confirmed what I'd suspected, but needed to hear directly. He felt entitled not just to his version of our shared past, but to control over how I lived my present. The cottage, my relationship with Jessica, my very narrative, all these he considered rightfully his to dictate. For years I had cooperated in my own erasure, believing it was the path of least resistance. Now I understood that no amount of compliance would ever be enough. Daniel didn't want me to be smaller, he wanted me to be invisible. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. Dad's really upset about the article. Says you threatened him. What's going on? I stared at the message, weighing my response carefully. The old Margaret would have apologized, would have tried to smooth things over, would have accepted responsibility for Daniel's discomfort. But I was no longer that woman. I didn't threaten your father, I typed back. We had an honest conversation about the past and about my cottage. I'm sorry he's upset, but I need to be truthful about my experiences. I hope you'll come to my next workshop to hear for yourself. I hit send before I could second-guess myself, then returned to preparing my dinner. Whatever happened next, whether Jessica came to understand or continued to see me through her father's lens, I had taken a stand. Not with dramatic gestures or revenge, but with something far more powerful. The simple insistence on my right to exist fully in my own story. As I sat down to eat, alone but not lonely, I realized that the countermove in this long game wasn't about defeating Daniel or even changing Jessica's mind. It was about reclaiming territory I had ceded years ago. My voice, my truth, my place in the world. And for the first time in decades, that territory felt solid beneath my feet. The following Tuesday, I arrived at Oak Ridge Elementary for Noah's science fair. The familiar hallways brought back memories of my teaching days. The colorful bulletin boards, the sound of children's voices, the smell of school cafeteria food that never quite changes. I had been happy here, confident in my purpose and value. Somewhere along the way, I had lost that confidence, allowing others to convince me that my contributions were minimal, my presence dispensable. Never again. I found Noah's booth easily, a impressive display about renewable energy, complete with a working solar-powered fan. His face lit up when he spotted me. "Grandma, you came!" He darted around the table to hug me, then dragged me back to show off his project. "Look, when the light hits the panel, it generates electricity to run the fan. And I calculated how much energy we could save if our whole school switched to solar power." "This is fantastic," I said, genuinely impressed. "Did you build this? Model yourself?" "Dad helped a little," Noah admitted. "But I did all the research and calculations, and I wrote the report by myself." As we chatted about his project, I felt a presence beside me. Jessica had arrived, looking tired but composed. I noticed she wore the earrings I'd given her for her 30th birthday, small silver leaves she'd once declared too understated for her taste. "A peace offering, perhaps?" "Mom," she acknowledged with a nod. "Noah's been excited for you to see his project." "It's remarkable," I said, keeping my tone light. "You should be very proud." Jessica watched as I continued to ask Noah questions about his research, her expression thoughtful. When Noah was called away by his science teacher for judging, she turned to me. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began hesitantly, "about asking myself whose version of our family feels true to me." I waited, not wanting to rush her. "The thing is," she continued, "I'm not sure I know anymore. I have these memories of you always being, I don't know, disapproving, distant. But then I see those photos, and they don't match what I thought I remembered." "Memory is complicated," I acknowledged. "Especially childhood memory, and we often revise our past to match what we're told about it later." Jessica nodded slowly. "Dad always described you as this joyless person who held him back, and I guess I just accepted that. It was easier than questioning it." "It usually is," I said softly. She glanced around the school gymnasium, filled with children proudly displaying their scientific discoveries. "You loved teaching, didn't you? I remember that much. You'd come home with these stories about your students, so excited about their progress." "I did love it," I confirmed. "Still do. That's partly why I started the community program." Jessica was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Is it true what you said in the article? That Dad deliberately kept you from advancing your career? That he controlled the finances even though you contributed more consistently?" The directness of the question surprised me. "Yes," I said simply. "It happened gradually, so gradually I hardly noticed until it was our established pattern. By the time I recognized it, questioning it felt disloyal somehow. Why didn't you ever say anything?" There was a hint of accusation in her voice. "To whom?" "You were a child, then a teenager who idolized your father, then a young woman establishing your own life. And by then, the narrative was set. I was the difficult one, the one who didn't understand business or ambition, the one holding everyone back with my provincial attitudes." Jessica flinched slightly at hearing her father's favorite criticisms of me articulated so plainly. "I've said those things about you," she admitted quietly. "To Ryan, to my friends. I've described you the way Dad always did." "I know," I said without rancor. We absorb the stories we're told about the people in our lives, especially when they come from someone we trust. Noah bounded back to us then, proudly displaying a blue ribbon. As we celebrated his success, I noticed Jessica watching me, really seeing me, perhaps for the first time in years. Not as an extension of her father's narrative, not as a convenient source of childcare or holiday meals, but as a person in my own right, with my own history and truth. It was a small moment, easily overlooked amid the noise and excitement of the science fair. But as we walked together to the parking lot afterward, Jessica said something that gave me hope. "I'd like to come to your next workshop," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "If that's okay, just to listen." "I'd like that," I replied, careful not to overreact to this tentative olive branch. "It's this Thursday at 6. She nodded, then surprised me by giving me a quick, awkward hug before ushering Noah into their car. As they drove away, I stood in the school parking lot, feeling something I hadn't experienced in a very long time, the possibility of being truly seen by my own daughter. Whether that possibility would materialize remained uncertain. Jessica had years of her father's influence to untangle, and Daniel would not relinquish his narrative easily. But for the first time, there was a crack in the foundation of his version of our family history, a small opening through which truth might eventually flow. As I drove home, I thought about the next phase of my plan. The community workshops were gaining attention. The legal review of my deed was proceeding. My financial independence, while modest, was secure. But the most important countermove was still to come. The one that would not just reclaim my past, but illuminate my future in ways even I couldn't yet imagine. The second chapter program had been running for 3 months when I received the certified letter from Daniel's lawyer. Outside my window, the first tentative blooms of spring brightened my small garden, daffodils and crocuses pushing through soil still cool from winter. I'd just returned from a particularly successful workshop, 27 women this time, including 3 who had driven from neighboring towns after hearing about the program. I recognized the law firm's name on the envelope immediately. Harrington. Powell and Reed, the same firm that had represented Daniel in our divorce. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, wondering what new pressure Daniel was applying. The contents were worse than I'd imagined. Daniel was formally challenging my right to discuss our marriage publicly, claiming defamation and emotional distress. The letter cited specific statements from the Gazette article and from my workshops. Statements attendees must have reported back to him. He was demanding I cease and desist all public commentary about our relationship and retract my false characterizations of our marriage. The final paragraph carried a thinly veiled threat. If I didn't comply, Daniel would be forced to take more aggressive measures to protect his reputation, which might necessitate a full airing of Mrs. Wilson's mental health challenges and financial incompetence. I sank into my kitchen chair, the letter clutched in my hand. This was Daniel's countermove, not a direct confrontation, but a legal intimidation tactic designed to silence me. He knew exactly what the threat implied: a public, humiliating examination of our marriage where his word, as the distinguished professor, the respected businessman, would carry more weight than mine. My first instinct was to call Lauren, but I stopped myself. This wasn't just a legal issue, it was a continuation of the pattern that had defined our marriage. Daniel rewriting our history, Daniel controlling the narrative, Daniel using his position and resources to diminish my voice. And as always, he was counting on my instinct to avoid conflict, to surrender rather than fight. Not this time. Instead of calling Lauren, I called the Oak Ridge Gazette and asked for Sarah Chen. When she answered, I kept my voice steady. "Sarah, it's Margaret Wilson. I've received a legal threat from my ex-husband regarding your article about the second chapter program. I think there's another story here if you're interested." Sarah's response was immediate and enthusiastic. "I'd love to hear more. Can we meet this afternoon?" We arranged to meet at Riverside Cafe in an hour. After hanging up, I carefully made copies of the legal letter, then called Thomas. He answered on the second ring. "Margaret, is everything all right?" "Daniel is threatening to sue me," I said without preamble, "for talking about our marriage in the Gazette article and at my workshops." Thomas was silent for a moment. "That sounds like Daniel," he finally said. "He's always been more concerned with appearances than reality. What are you going to do?" "I'm meeting with the reporter from the Gazette. I think it's time people understood exactly what Daniel is trying to suppress." Another pause, longer this time. "Margaret, are you sure that's wise? Daniel can be vindictive when cornered." "I'm counting on it," I replied, surprising myself with my certainty. His reaction will reveal more than my accusations ever could. After we hung up, I changed into a simple but professional outfit. A navy blue dress I'd recently purchased, more tailored and confident than my old wardrobe of shapeless cardigans and elastic waist pants. Daniel had always preferred me in muted colors and forgiving silhouettes, claiming they were more appropriate for my age and position. Another form of erasure I now recognized. Sarah Chen was already waiting when I arrived at the cafe, her notebook open and recorder ready. In her early 30s, with a direct gaze and no-nonsense demeanor, she had approached the original article, about second chapter, with surprising empathy and insight for someone so much younger than her subjects. "Thank you for meeting me," I said, settling across from her. "I wanted to share this with you." I handed her the copy of Daniel's legal letter. Sarah read it carefully, her eyebrows rising at the thinly veiled threats. "This is serious," she said when she finished, "but also potentially newsworthy. Would you be willing to go on record about this intimidation attempt?" "That's why I'm here," I confirmed. "But I want to be clear. This isn't just about Daniel and me. It's about how older women are silenced, how our histories are rewritten, how our experiences are dismissed as delusions or exaggerations." Sarah nodded, already taking notes. "A pattern you've seen with many women in your program." "Exactly. Daniel's letter exemplifies what I've been trying to address, the way women in my position are pressured to accept others' versions of our lives, even when those versions erase our truth." For the next hour, I shared with Sarah more details than I had in the original article, the specific ways Daniel had controlled our finances while building a narrative of my incompetence, how he had gradually isolated me from friends and colleagues who might have offered perspective, how he had enlisted Jessica in reinforcing his version of our marriage after the divorce. "What's particularly troubling," I explained, "is how effectively he's used my marginalized position against me. As an older woman, as someone whose career was in nurturing rather than achievement, as someone who prioritized family stability over professional advancement, all these make me easier to dismiss." Sarah looked up from her notes. "And yet, you're not allowing yourself to be dismissed anymore." "No," I agreed, "not anymore." As our conversation wound down, Sarah posed a question I hadn't anticipated. "What do you hope will come from sharing this story? What's your end goal here?" I considered carefully before answering. "I don't want to destroy Daniel, if that's what you're asking. I'm not interested in revenge. What I want is to reclaim my narrative, not just with Daniel, but with Jessica, with my community, with myself. I want to stand in my truth without apology." Sarah nodded, seemingly satisfied with my answer. "I'd like to write this as a follow-up piece to the original article, the story of a woman refusing to be legally intimidated into silence about her own life could be powerful." "I think so too," I said. "And Sarah, thank you for taking me seriously." Her smile was warm. "That's the bare minimum you deserve, Mrs. Wilson." On my drive home, I felt an unexpected lightness. For decades, I had carried the weight of Daniel's judgment, his dismissal, his rewriting of our shared history. Even after the divorce, I had continued to shoulder that burden, accepting his version as the official record. But with each step I took to assert my own truth, The community program, the Gazette article, and now this direct challenge to his legal threats. That weight diminished. The confrontation I'd been avoiding for so long was finally coming, and rather than dreading it, I found myself almost welcoming it. At least in open conflict, the dynamics that had shadowed our relationship would be visible, not just to others, but to me as well. I had just arrived home when my phone rang. Jessica. I answered with a neutral greeting, unsure what to expect. "Dad just called me," she began without preamble, her voice tight with tension. "He says you're talking to reporters." Again, spreading more stories about him. "What are you doing, Mom?" I moved to my porch swing, settling into its familiar comfort. "Your father's lawyer sent me a threatening letter, demanding I stop speaking about my own life experiences. I shared that letter with the reporter who wrote the original article." "Why would you do that?" Jessica's voice rose in frustration. "Don't you know how this affects all of us? Dad says people are starting to question his integrity because of your stories. His colleagues are whispering behind his back." The old guilt flickered briefly, the ingrained sense that I was responsible for everyone's comfort and happiness, that expressing my truth was somehow selfish if it inconvenienced others. I took a deep breath and pushed the feeling aside. "Jessica," I said gently, "your father is attempting to legally prevent me from discussing my own life. Do you think that's reasonable?" A pause, then a sigh. "I think you're both being stubborn. Why can't you just let things be? Accept that your marriage ended and move on without all this public drama." "Because letting things be means accepting a false narrative," I explained. "It means agreeing that your father's version, where I was incompetent, joyless, mentally unstable, is the truth. And it isn't." "That's not how he describes you to me," Jessica protested, though I noted a hint of uncertainty in her voice. "What has he told you about our marriage, Jessica? About why it ended? About me?" Another pause, longer this time. He says you were always unhappy, that you resented his success, that you made the home environment tense and difficult, that he tried for years to make it work, but you couldn't or wouldn't meet him halfway. The familiar distortions twisted in my chest, but I kept my voice steady. "And you believed that without question? Without considering my perspective?" "You never offered a perspective." Jessica's frustration bubbled over. "You just accepted the divorce, moved into the cottage, and carried on like nothing had changed. You never defended yourself, never challenged his version. What was I supposed to think?" Her words hit me with unexpected force. She was right. I had retreated into resignation, had accepted Daniel's narrative so completely that I hadn't even attempted to share my own with our daughter. My silence had been interpreted as confirmation. "You're right," I admitted. "I should have talked to you about what really happened. But Jessica, I was shattered by the divorce. By your father's betrayal, yes, but even more by how quickly you aligned with him, how readily you accepted his characterization of me." "I didn't," she began, then stopped herself. After a moment, she continued more quietly. "Maybe I did. It was easier to believe Dad's version because it was cleaner somehow. A simple story about incompatible people rather than anything more complicated." This small acknowledgement felt monumental, the first crack in the solid wall of Jessica's certainty. I pressed gently into that opening. "Would you be willing to hear my version now? Not to change your mind about your father, but just to understand what I experienced in our marriage?" Jessica was quiet so long I thought she might have hung up. Finally, she said, "I think I would, but not over the phone. Can I come over tomorrow evening? After the kids are in bed?" Relief washed through me. "Yes, of course. I'll make tea." When we hung up, I sat on the porch swing a while longer, watching the lengthening shadows in my garden. The conversation with Jessica had revealed something important. My silence had been as much a factor in her acceptance of Daniel's narrative as his persuasiveness. By retreating into myself after the divorce, I had effectively abandoned the field, leaving Daniel's version unchallenged. But now, with my community program growing, with the Gazette articles, with the simple act of standing in my truth without apology, I was creating space for a different narrative. Not just for myself, but for Jessica, for the women in my workshops, perhaps even for Noah and Zoe as they grew. The next morning, Sarah Chen called to tell me the follow-up article would run in Sunday's paper. "My editor is excited about it," she said. "He thinks it touches on broader issues about how women's stories are controlled and contained, especially as they age." "That's exactly what I hoped," I told her. "Thank you for understanding the larger context." "Just to prepare you," Sarah added, "we reached out to Daniel for comment. He declined to speak directly, but his lawyer provided a statement suggesting your claims are exaggerated and potentially defamatory. We're including it for balance, but framing it clearly as a legal response rather than a personal one." "That's fair," I acknowledged. I never expected this to be one-sided. After we hung up, I spent the morning in my garden, hands in the cool soil, mind working through what I wanted to share with Jessica that evening. Not accusations or grievances, but my lived experience, how it had felt to be gradually erased within my own marriage, to have my contributions minimized, my perspective dismissed, my very self slowly redefined according to someone else's needs. I was so absorbed in my thoughts that I almost missed the sound of a car pulling into my driveway. Looking up, I was startled to see Daniel himself emerging from his sleek black sedan, his expression set in the cold determination I knew all too well. For a moment, I considered retreating into the house, avoiding this confrontation. But that impulse, the instinct to accommodate, to smooth things over, to disappear rather than disturb, was exactly what had led me to this point. Instead, I straightened, brushed the soil from my gardening gloves, and faced him directly. "Daniel?" I acknowledged with a nod. "This is unexpected." He approached the garden gate but didn't open it, maintaining the boundary between us. "Margaret?" he responded, his voice controlled but with an undercurrent of tension. "We need to talk about this newspaper situation. If you're here about the legal letter, I've already discussed it with the reporter," I said evenly. "Sunday's paper will have a follow-up article." Daniel's jaw tightened. "So Thomas was right. You're really going through with this public assault on my character." "Is that how you see it?" I asked, genuinely curious. "As an assault on you, rather than an assertion of my own experience?" "Your experience directly contradicts reality," Daniel said, making air quotes around the word. "You're painting me as some kind of villain when all I did was try to make our marriage work despite your difficulties." The familiar framing, my difficulties, as the central problem of our marriage, nearly pulled me back into our old dynamic, where I would automatically question myself, doubt my perceptions, accept blame. But the months of leading my workshop, of hearing other women describe similar gaslighting, had strengthened my resolve. "That's your perspective," I said calmly. "I have mine. After 30 years, I think I've earned the right to share it." Daniel's expression darkened. "I've been patient with you, Margaret. I've allowed you to stay in the cottage despite that ridiculous community center program undermining my reputation. I've tolerated your sudden independence phase without comment. But this newspaper vendetta crosses a line." "Allowed me to stay in the cottage?" I repeated, focusing on this particular revelation. "The cottage bought primarily with my inheritance from my mother? The one you claimed was a generous divorce settlement while quietly inserting a clause giving you right of first refusal at a fixed price?" Daniel's momentary silence confirmed what Lauren had suspected. He had never expected me to notice that clause, let alone challenge it. "That clause was standard legal protection," he finally said, his tone dismissive, "and irrelevant to the Current situation. What matters is that you're deliberately damaging my reputation with these distorted accounts of our marriage. I removed my gardening gloves and looked directly at him. Daniel, I haven't named you in my workshops. I've shared my experiences in general terms. The only reason your name entered the public conversation was through that Gazette article, which focused primarily on the second chapter program, not on you. People know who I am, he snapped. This town isn't that big. Every time you talk about your supposedly controlling ex-husband, everyone knows exactly who you mean. There was something almost poignant in his indignation. The man who had spent decades carefully crafting his public image, now confronted with an alternate narrative he couldn't control. For the first time, I felt a flicker of genuine compassion for him. Not because he deserved it, but because I could finally see the insecurity driving his behavior. I understand this is uncomfortable for you, I said, my voice softening slightly. Having someone else's perspective challenge the story you've told yourself and others. But Daniel, did you really think I would never speak about my own life? That I would just disappear into the background of your preferred narrative? I thought you would be reasonable, he said, as if that explained everything. I thought you understood the importance of discretion, of maintaining certain appearances. Even when those appearances required me to accept a completely false characterization of myself, to agree that I was incompetent, joyless, mentally unstable. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. I never used those exact words. No, I agreed. You were always careful about your phrasing. But the implication was clear, not just to me, but to Jessica, to your colleagues, to everyone in our social circle. You constructed a version of me that made your departure seem not just justified, but almost noble. The successful man finally breaking free from his burdensome wife. A flicker of something, recognition? Shame? Crossed his face before he masked it with the smooth, professional expression I knew so well. This conversation is pointless, he said abruptly. My lawyer will handle the situation from here. I just came to give you one last chance to retract your statements before things get unpleasant. I shook my head slowly. I won't be retracting anything, Daniel. And if your lawyer pursues this, I'll be countersuing over that cottage clause. Lauren thinks we have an excellent case for predatory terms entered under duress. Daniel's expression hardened. Lauren Davis? That retired ambulance chaser is giving you legal advice now? Margaret, you're out of your depth here. My firm handles multi-million-dollar corporate cases. They'll demolish any countersuit. Perhaps, I acknowledged. But how will that look to your colleagues, to your investors? The distinguished Professor Wilson using his corporate legal team to silence his ex-wife's community support program, threatening her home? I don't think that aligns with the image you've worked so hard to cultivate. For a moment, genuine uncertainty flickered in Daniel's eyes, the first time in our conversation that he seemed to consider my perspective might matter. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, reconsidering. Jessica mentioned she's coming to see you tonight, he said finally, changing tactics. I hope you're not planning to drag her into this mess. She asked to hear my perspective on our marriage, I replied truthfully. I intend to share it honestly, but without trying to turn her against you. She deserves to understand both sides of her parents' relationship. Daniel's laugh was short and bitter. Both sides, as if there's some grand revelation you've been keeping secret all these years. The simple truth, Margaret, is that we grew apart. You became increasingly dissatisfied and difficult. I tried to make it work, but eventually, I couldn't anymore. That's all there is to it. The confidence with which he delivered this revised history, so different from his initial abandonment, his cruel dismissals, his systematic undermining, was almost impressive. In that moment, I realized Daniel truly believed his own narrative. He had rewritten our past so completely in his mind that my version seemed not just inconvenient, but incomprehensible to him. If that's what you need to believe, Daniel, I can't stop you, I said quietly. But it's not my truth, and I won't pretend it is anymore. Not for Jessica, not for this town, and certainly not for your reputation. He stared at me for a long moment, as if seeing a stranger. Perhaps he was. The Margaret he had known, or thought he had known, would have yielded by now, would have apologized, would have agreed to maintain whatever fiction preserved his comfort. "You've changed," he finally said, his voice somewhere between accusation and reluctant admiration. "No," I corrected him gently. "I've remembered who I was before I started believing your version of me." Without another word, Daniel turned and walked back to his car. I watched him drive away, struck by a curious sense of closure. For all his threats and manipulations, he had ultimately revealed more than he had intended: his deep need to control, the narrative, his assumption that his perspective inherently outweighed mine, his genuine confusion when confronted with a Margaret who refused to disappear. That evening, as I prepared for Jessica's visit, I felt strangely calm. The encounter with Daniel had crystallized something important. This wasn't just about setting the record straight about our marriage. It was about reclaiming my right to interpret my own life, to trust my own perceptions, to exist as a full and complex person rather than someone else's supporting character. I brewed a pot of herbal tea, chamomile and lavender, soothing without being sedative, and arranged a plate of the lemon cookies Jessica had loved since childhood, not as a peace offering or bribe, but as a simple expression of care, an acknowledgement of our shared history beyond Daniel's influence. Jessica arrived precisely at 8, her expression guarded but not hostile. She had changed from her work, clothes into jeans and a sweater, a small signal that this wasn't an official visit but something more personal. "The garden looks nice," she commented as I welcomed her in. "Those daffodils are really coming along." "Thank you," I said, leading her to the living room where tea and cookies waited. Gardening has become a kind of therapy for me. We settled. On opposite ends of the sofa, the familiar awkwardness between us softened slightly by the informal setting. Jessica accepted a cup of tea, wrapping her hands around it as if gathering courage. "Dad came to see you today," she began, a statement rather than a question. "Yes," I confirmed. "He's concerned about the newspaper article." Jessica nodded slowly. "He says you're distorting things, creating problems that weren't there." I took a careful sip of tea, considering my response. From his perspective, I imagine it feels that way. When someone has controlled the narrative for so long, any alternative view seems like distortion. "And from your perspective?" Jessica asked, meeting my eyes directly for the first time. "From my perspective, I'm finally speaking my truth after decades of silence," I said simply. "Not to hurt your father, but because my experience deserves to be acknowledged. By him, by you, by myself." Jessica set down her teacup with careful precision. "That's why I'm here, to listen to your perspective. But Mom, I need to understand. Why now? Why, after all these years of just accepting everything?" It was a fair question, one I had asked myself repeatedly over the past months. "I think it started that day at Thanksgiving," I admitted. Standing in the doorway with that pie, looking at a table with no place for me, it was like seeing my whole life in miniature. How I'd become this accessory, useful for what I could provide but not essential enough to actually include. Jessica winced slightly but didn't interrupt. "After that, it was like waking up from a long sleep," I continued. "I started seeing patterns I'd been blind to, or maybe had chosen not to see. How your father had gradually isolated me over the years, how he had built a narrative of me as incompetent and difficult, how that narrative had shaped how others saw me. Even you." I never thought you were incompetent, Jessica protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Didn't you? I asked gently. When was the last time you asked for my advice on something important? When did you last describe me to others? As intelligent or insightful rather than just maternal or supportive? Jessica's silence was answer enough. I don't blame you, I hastened to add. You absorbed the story that surrounded you, your father's story primarily. We all did, including me. That's what I'm trying to change now. Not just for myself, but for all the women in my program who've had their narratives controlled by others. Jessica reached for a lemon cookie, turning it over in her hands without eating it. What was it really like? Your marriage to Dad, I mean. From your side. I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. It started well. We were young, ambitious in different ways. I loved teaching, loved the direct impact I could have on children's lives. Your father loved ideas, systems, the prestige that came with academic recognition. For a while, our differences complemented each other. Jessica nodded, encouraging me to continue. After you were born, things began to shift. Your father's career was accelerating, requiring more networking, more image management. My work remained steady. Same classroom, same salary, same daily challenges and rewards. He began to see my consistency as lack of ambition, my contentment as complacency. I remember him saying that, Jessica admitted quietly, that you lacked vision, that you were satisfied with mediocrity. The familiar criticism stung, but I pressed on. What he called mediocrity, I called purpose. I was good at teaching, Jessica, really good. Those children thrived in my classroom. But that kind of success doesn't come with titles or salary increases, or public recognition. It's quiet, cumulative, often invisible to anyone not directly involved. I never thought of it that way, Jessica said slowly. Dad always made it sound like you just settled. Like you could have done more but chose not to. That was his interpretation, I acknowledged. But from my perspective, I was choosing depth over breadth, impact over advancement. Different values, not lesser ones. We talked for hours, moving. From the broad strokes of my marriage to specific incidents Jessica remembered, family vacations interpreted through Daniel's lens versus my experience, conflicts she had witnessed but never fully understood, patterns of behavior she had accepted as normal that now appeared in a different light. There's something I still don't understand, Jessica said as our conversation began to wind down. If things were so bad, why did you stay? Why not leave years ago? I considered the question thoughtfully. It wasn't so bad in the dramatic ways people often imagine. Your father never hit me, never had flagrant affairs, never drank to excess or gambled away our savings. The erosion was gradual, small dismissals, subtle control, careful isolation. By the time I recognized the pattern, I had already internalized so much of his narrative that I doubted my own perceptions. And then he left you anyway, Jessica said softly, a new understanding in her voice. Yes, I confirmed. When I was no longer useful in the ways he needed, when his status was secure enough that he didn't require my domestic support, when you were grown and successful, reflecting well on him, he discarded me. Just like he's threatening to do to you if you don't align with his version of events now. Jessica's head snapped up. What do you mean? Has he suggested that siding with me in this current situation would damage your relationship with him? I asked. Has he implied that your loyalty is being tested? The flicker in Jessica's eyes told me I'd hit the mark. He said I needed to decide whose version I believed, she admitted, that I couldn't have it both ways. Classic Daniel, I said without rancor. Creating false binaries, forcing choices that don't need to be made. But Jessica, that's not how truth works. You can recognize my experience without invalidating everything you've shared with your father. You can hold complexity. Jessica was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this. Then she asked the question I'd been both hoping for and dreading. "Mom, those photos Uncle Thomas found, the ones in the newspaper article, were they representative? Were you really that happy? With us? With Dad?" The vulnerability in her voice squeezed my heart. She wasn't just asking about photographs. She was asking about the emotional reality of her childhood home. "Yes," I said simply. "Not every moment, of course. All marriages have their challenges, their disagreements. But for many years, I was genuinely happy in our family. I loved being your mother. I found joy in creating a home where you could thrive. I even loved your father, deeply and truly, until the constant erosion of his respect made that impossible." Tears welled in Jessica's eyes, the first I'd seen from her in years. "I think I needed to hear that," she whispered. "I think I've been carrying this fear that my whole childhood was a lie, that underneath our family photos was this terrible unhappiness I never recognized." I reached across the sofa and took her hand, the first real physical connection we'd shared since Thanksgiving. "Your childhood wasn't a lie, Jessica. The love was real. The happy moments were real. What was false was the narrative that developed later, that I had somehow failed as a wife and mother, that I had been a burden rather than a partner." She squeezed my hand, not pulling away. "I'm sorry I believed him so easily, that I didn't question his version more. He's very persuasive," I said with a small smile, "and it's natural to want to believe your parents' perspective, especially when the alternative is uncomfortable." As Jessica prepared to leave, she paused at the door, turning back to face me. "The article on Sunday. Do you think it will make things worse with Dad?" "Probably temporarily," I admitted. "But in the long run, I think it's necessary. Not just for me, but for all the women in similar situations who need to know they can reclaim their stories." Jessica nodded slowly. "I understand that now. And Mom, I'd like to come to your next workshop if that's still okay. I think I need to hear more." After she left, I sat in my quiet cottage, reflecting on the evening's revelations. Jessica had listened, really listened, perhaps for the first time since the divorce. She hadn't fully embraced my perspective, hadn't rejected her father's influence entirely, but she had created space for my truth alongside his. It was more than I had dared to hope for. As I prepared for bed, my phone chimed with a text from Thomas. "Daniel called. He's rattled. Whatever you said today made an impact. Stay strong." I smiled at the message, a quiet confirmation that the ground was shifting. Daniel's controlled narrative was beginning to fracture, not just with Jessica, but perhaps even in his own mind. The revelation wasn't about destroying him or even vindicating myself. It was about creating space for a more complex, more truthful understanding of our shared past. And in that space, I was discovering, there was room for me to exist fully, without apology or erasure. Room for my perspective to matter. Room for my voice to be heard. The Sunday paper arrived early. The follow-up article prominently featured on the front page of the local section. Local woman challenges ex-husband's legal threat to silence her story. Sarah Chen had done a remarkable job, presenting the situation not as a petty domestic dispute, but as a reflection of broader societal patterns. How women's voices are controlled, how their histories are rewritten, how their experiences are delegitimized, especially as they age. My phone began ringing almost immediately. Women from my workshop expressing support, neighbors offering encouragement, even a local attorney volunteering pro bono assistance if Daniel's threats escalated to actual legal action. The community, I had thought lost to me after the divorce, was reforming around this new version of Margaret Wilson. Not as Daniel's ex-wife or Jessica's mother, but as a woman standing firmly in her own truth. And as the day progressed, A different kind of revelation unfolded, not just in how others saw me, but in how I saw myself. The woman who had stood in Jessica's doorway at Thanksgiving, pie in hand, accepting erasure as her due, felt like a distant memory. In her place was someone I was still getting to know, someone who had always been there beneath layers of accommodation and self-doubt, someone who, at 64, was finally coming into her full and rightful existence. That evening, as dusk settled over my garden, I sat on my porch swing and watched the first fireflies of the season emerge, their gentle lights pulsing in the gathering darkness. Each tiny flash seemed to echo the sentiment that had been growing within me since that Thanksgiving turning point. I am here. I exist. My light matters. And for the first time in decades, I believed it without reservation. Summer arrived in Oak Ridge with a particular sweetness that year. My garden had never been more vibrant, not just the flowers and herbs I'd always tended, but new vegetables stretching in neat rows behind the cottage. The second chapter program had expanded to 3 weekly sessions, with a waiting list that constantly renewed itself as word spread through neighboring towns. I'd hired 2 part-time assistants, both graduates of earlier workshops, to help manage the growing demand. The most significant transformation, however, wasn't in my garden or my program, but in the quiet confidence that had become my constant companion. The woman who had once apologized for her existence now moved through the world with purpose and clarity, no longer seeking permission to occupy space. Daniel's threatened lawsuit had never materialized. After the second Gazette article generated widespread community support for me, his lawyers quietly withdrew their demands. Thomas later told me that Daniel's investors had expressed concern about the potential publicity, suggesting it might be better to let the matter fade from public attention. For once, Daniel's focus on appearances had worked in my favor. My relationship with Jessica had evolved into something new, not the unquestioning closeness I'd once fantasized about, but a more honest connection built on mutual respect rather than obligation. She had attended 3 workshops, sitting quietly in the back at first, then gradually participating in discussions. Watching her engage with other women's stories, I saw recognition dawn in her eyes. Patterns she had accepted as normal revealed, as part of larger systemic issues. "I think I'm starting to understand why this matters so much to you," she told me after one particularly powerful session, where a woman in her 70s had shared her journey of reclaiming her voice after 50 years of marriage. "It's not just about you and Dad. It's about something bigger." "Yes," I confirmed, though understanding my own situation was where it started. Noah and Zoe had become regular visitors to my cottage, no longer scheduled around Jessica's convenience, but at their own request. They loved helping in the garden, asking questions about plants, taking pride in vegetables they had helped grow. I taught them to bake, to mend, to identify birds, not as services I provided to maintain relevance in their lives, but as genuine exchanges of knowledge and affection. The cottage itself had transformed as well. With Lauren's help, I had successfully challenged the predatory clause in my deed. Daniel had eventually agreed to remove it entirely rather than face a potentially embarrassing legal battle. With full ownership secured, I had made the space truly mine, painting walls in colors that pleased me, rearranging furniture for comfort rather than appearance, hanging art that spoke to my sensibilities rather than anyone else's expectations. On a warm Saturday in July, I hosted a garden party, a first for me who had always been a guest or helper at others' gatherings, never the center of my own social event. The invitation list reflected my newly authentic life. Women from the second chapter program, neighbors who had offered support after the Gazette articles, Thomas and his wife, Eleanor, and her book club friends, Lauren and her partner, Jessica, and the children. Noticeably absent was Daniel, not because I couldn't forgive him. Forgiveness had been an essential part of my healing, but because I recognized that true reconciliation would require an acknowledgement of truth he wasn't yet capable of offering. perhaps never would be. And that was okay. My well-being no longer depended on his validation. I was arranging flowers on the long tables I'd set up beneath the oak tree when Jessica arrived early, carrying a homemade quiche and a bottle of wine. "This is a first," she commented with a small smile. "You hosting, me bringing food." "A welcome role reversal," I agreed, accepting her offerings. She glanced around at the preparations, tables decorated with mason jars of wildflowers, fairy lights strung through tree branches for later when dusk fell, a buffet table waiting for potluck contributions. "It looks beautiful, Mom. You've done an amazing job with this place." "Thank you," I said simply, accepting the compliment without deflection or qualification. Another small but significant change in how I moved through the world. Jessica helped me arrange the final details, our movements around each other easier than they had been in years. As we worked, she broached a subject I hadn't expected. "I've been thinking about what you said about purpose versus advancement," she began, carefully arranging napkins at each place setting, "about choosing depth over breadth." "Oh?" I prompted, curious where this was leading. "I've always measured success the way Dad does: promotions, recognition, external validation. But lately I've been wondering if I'm missing something important." She looked up at me, a question in her eyes. "Are you happier now? Working at the community center, teaching your workshops, living more? I don't know. Authentically?" The question deserved careful consideration. "I am," I said finally. Not because what I'm doing now is inherently better than what I did before, but because I'm doing it from a place of choice rather than obligation. That's the real difference. Jessica nodded thoughtfully. "I've been so focused on climbing that I never stopped to ask if I even want what's at the top. Ryan and I fight constantly about my work hours. The kids need more of my time. And honestly, most days I don't even enjoy what I'm doing." "What would you enjoy?" I asked, genuinely curious. "I don't know," she admitted. "That's what scares me. I've been following this path for so long, I'm not sure I know how to find another one." I smiled, recognizing in her dilemma an echo of my own journey. That's what the second chapter program is really about: finding your authentic path, even when it's not clearly marked. You're welcome to join us more regularly, you know. "I might take you up on that," she said, and I could see she meant it. Guests began arriving soon after, filling my small garden with conversation and laughter. I moved among them with an ease that still occasionally surprised me, no longer apologizing for my presence or focusing exclusively on others' needs. When Thomas raised a toast to Margaret and her second chapter, the warm applause felt like confirmation of something I had been slowly learning: that my value didn't depend on what I provided to others, but on the simple fact of my humanity. As dusk fell and fairy lights twinkled overhead, I found myself sitting with Lauren on the porch swing, watching the gathering with a sense of quiet satisfaction. "Did you ever imagine this?" Lauren asked, gesturing toward the lively scene. "When you first came to me about that cottage deed, did you picture any of this?" "Not at all," I admitted. "I just wanted to secure my home. The rest. It grew, organically, from that first step toward self-determination." Lauren nodded. "That's how it usually works. One boundary leads to another, and suddenly you're building a life you actually want rather than one you've been assigned." Her words captured something essential about my transformation. It hadn't been a dramatic reinvention, but a series of small choices, each building on the last. The decision to close the joint account with Jessica, the silver sold to fund my independence, the call to Thomas that had led to those revelatory photographs, the first workshop at the community center, each step modest in isolation, but together forming a path away from erasure and toward reclamation. As the party wound down and guests began to depart, Noah approached me with a small, carefully wrapped package. "Grandma, I made this for you," he said, his expression serious. For your new beginning. Inside the wrapping was a clay plaque, clearly handmade, with words pressed into its surface. Margaret's Place. At the bottom, in smaller letters, where everyone gets a seat at the table. Tears sprang to my eyes as I pulled him into a hug. It's perfect, I whispered. Thank you. Later, after the last guest had gone and Jessica had taken the sleepy children home, I sat alone in my garden, Noah's plaque beside me, the fairy lights still twinkling overhead. The woman who had stood in a doorway at Thanksgiving, pie in hand, nowhere to sit, had transformed not through dramatic revolution, but through quiet insistence on her own worth. I thought about all the women in my workshops, each taking her own tentative steps toward reclamation. About Jessica, questioning the path she had accepted without examination. About Noah and Zoe, growing up with a grandmother who modeled self-respect, rather than self-erasure. The journey wasn't complete. Transformation never is. There would still be moments of doubt, old patterns that threatened to reassert themselves, relationships that required ongoing negotiation. But the foundation had shifted irrevocably. I had claimed my seat at the table, not just at Jessica's Thanksgiving dinner, but at the feast of my own life. And I had discovered, through this unexpected second chapter, that the table was large enough for everyone who approached with respect and recognition. That true belonging never required diminishment or erasure. That even at 64, there was time to become more fully myself than I had ever been before. With that knowledge secure in my heart, I gathered Noah's plaque and went inside, ready to rest and dream and wake to another day of purpose and possibility, my own. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.